I'm co-chair along with Kyle. And in addition, we have Adam Swick at Ackerman, who's our communication manager, and our education directors are Jennifer Jenkins and Moran in the BVI, and Ben Sewell from Sewell and Kettler Lawyers in Sydney, Australia.
Hi, this is Kyle, the other co-chair. We're going to do this like one of those, 1990s voicemails where it's like, hi, and then we toss back and forth. But the membership relations director, and I think one of the things I want to highlight as we go through all of these slides is, it's the international committee, and all of these elements of it are very international, including our leadership. As you see on this slide, we have Minglei Wu, who's in London, Ken Kraft, who's special projects, is in Canada. Our newsletter editors, Adam Crane, is in the Caymans, and then the other newsletter editor, Evan Zucker, is here in New York. So we hit a lot of places.
So what makes our committee a little bit different than all the other membership committees is there is a international membership committee, and then there's also an international committee at the board level. And so we are very lucky to have both Steve Lerner and Steve Spitzer oversee and be involved in our committee as well in their roles as serving on that international committee. And Steve Lerner is with us tonight, so we appreciate him joining as well.
And it's some of the things that we recently did, just in case you missed it, that you might still be able to see on the link there. On the 25th, we did an ABI Live Judgment Enforcement and Venue Considerations, which is co-hosted with the Asset Sales Committee, which we tend to do a lot of things with. But it was a very interesting discussion, and certainly encourage you all to look into it. And we also recently published a newsletter. And I think as the folks in the asset sale were saying, newsletters are a great way to kind of get involved and get an opportunity to write. And much like with the asset sale committee, we look at the newsletter as a way to not just write articles, but a lot of the topics that start in a newsletter then become panel topics at some of the conferences that we're involved in. So it's a really great way to get involved and to get noticed, and it often leads to not just being published, but actually often appearing on panels. So we really encourage people to get involved. And as you'll see, looking at what we did in January, it's very international, and we make an effort to try to hit as many parts of the globe as we can. So in particular, if you have had a case or you worked with somebody on something that's international, we'd really be interested in hearing that. In our last newsletter, we talked about dip financing in Spain, the ability to recover goods in Mexico, the new reforms that came into place under the Nigerian Companies and Allied Matters Act, which was enacted in August of 2020, and some of the recent developments on the rule in Gibbs. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a common law concept that basically says where a contract is governed by the law of a particular country, it cannot be discharged or compromised by the insolvency laws of another country unless you've submitted to the jurisdiction of the country that actually the contract is governed by. And there's been a lot of recent case law. Rare earth was a Hong Kong case that kind of followed the rule of Gibbs, and then modern land was a case by Judge Glenn in the Southern District of New York that kind of went against the common law rule of Gibbs, and said that if you bring a Chapter 15 in New York and want to compromise a U.S. debt document, we're okay with that. And then we also had stuff on our International Matter of the Year, which was our very first International Matter of the Year. We had such a close vote that we decided to have a Matter of the Year and an honorable mention, because I think it was actually one vote difference. And the winner was LATAM Airlines, which is a case that's near and dear to me, as I was one of the debtor counsel in that case. I did not vote, just to be clear. And the honorable mention was Luckin Coffee, which was another really interesting case with a lot of international components. And we encourage people to apply to our contest next year.
So here are some stuff that we have coming up before we turn to some of the hot issues we think are going to be interesting in the international insolvency world in 2023. We try to do a meet and greet twice a year. We did one in June. And so we have our next meet and greet with our committee February 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern. The reason for the weird time is we try to capture literally people all around the world and trying to find a time that somewhat worked, at least for our leadership between Australia and Europe. We landed on 3 o'clock. So hopefully for those of you in the United States and around the world listening to this, hopefully that time will work and you will join us. We also have a webinar coming up in late February, early March, date to be determined, on recent cross-border cases involving Latin America. We are still looking for people interested in speaking on that webinar. If you are interested, please reach out to Ken Kraft for leadership for our committee to let him know that that's something that you would be interested in. Additionally, ABI spring meeting, we are going to be focusing on Luckin, which we just mentioned was the honorable mention for our first annual award, and we're going to be focusing on a cross-border case study using that case as an example. We are also planning a committee happy hour at ABI spring meeting. So again, we hope you will join our committee if you're not yet a member and join us at that happy hour. As Kyle said, and as Jim said for their committee, we too are always looking for authors. Our spring newsletter, we're hoping to publish probably, I don't know, late March, early April, since we just published something in January. So if you are interested in writing, probably targeting at least an initial draft by the end of February, and please reach out to our co-newsletter editors, Adam and Evan. And finally, like our good friends at the Asset Sales Committee, we also started, as Kyle said, our own award, and this will be our second year, and our submissions will be due in the fall, so date to be determined, but please keep an eye out for that. So we wanted to focus on a couple hot issues. The first one was actually brought to our attention by Ben Swell, who serves as the co-education director for our committee. He let us know that Australia is actually undergoing a major review of their insolvency rules, and that report is due to their federal parliament in May of 2023. And Ben has actually been asked to give evidence to the parliamentary committee at the end of this month, which is really exciting. And he will be writing an article for our committee newsletter about, his experience and the reforms that they're implementing. So definitely stay tuned for that. Additionally, with respect to Asia, we wanted to point out that China's mainland this year recognized the first Hong Kong insolvency case. Basically, what happened was the two regions signed an agreement in May of 2021, although the decision only recently came out. And up until now, China had not signed any international treaties or implemented any reciprocal agreements with any foreign countries or even their own regions. So it'll be interesting to see, if there will be other recognitions going forward. Additionally, another thing to keep your eye on is kind of the battle for who will reign in Asia. Singapore is obviously trying to become kind of the restructuring hub. And as many of you know, Judge Sanchi recently became one of the bankruptcy judges for Singapore. So again, keep an eye on what's going on in Asia. And with that, I will pass it to Kyle.
And then, in Europe, we're looking at the continued effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's particularly on the energy industry, which has been heavily disrupted. It used to be very reliant on Russian natural gas, and now companies that were involved in pipelines and other things in that industry are looking into distress, and other industries are getting an opportunity. And then there's some of the topics that you've seen in some of our newsletters, but we think will continue to evolve over the next year. Again, that Gibbs rule with the kind of competing decisions out of Hong Kong and the United States. There seems to be a tendency to the common law countries to continue to follow the rule of Gibbs, and for the United States to kind of go its own way. And then, as I think many of you are probably aware, there's been quite a lot of crypto insolvencies in the last year, and that we expect to continue. But from an international perspective, what we're interested in seeing is how that's going to play out from the perspective of jurisdictional battles. We've seen that already in the FTX case, where there is some competition between the Delaware case and the Bermuda proceedings and who controls what assets. And that's going to be particularly interesting in the context of entities that didn't have the greatest books and records, and it's not necessarily clear where assets are to be able to decide who has jurisdiction or who controls different assets that may be valuable. And that's going to be a big element of those cases going forward. Some contract issues we've seen in the last year in the Alto Maipo case in Delaware, which was a Brazilian entity, it's a Brazilian mining entity. The Delaware Bankruptcy Court determined that it can't assume and assign contracts where one of the counterparties isn't actually subject to their jurisdiction of the United States, which is, I think, different than how things are currently coming out in the Southern District of New York, which is interesting because a lot of international companies, look at those two jurisdictions and where they may prefer to file to make sure they get all the tools that come along with Chapter 11. There's certain limitations on the scope of discovery that we think is going to continue to be interesting, because a lot of times in a global insolvency, it's hard to get discovery in certain jurisdictions. We've seen people file Chapter 15s just to get the power under 1521A4 to actually seek discovery of certain entities in the United States, and other adopters of the model law where they have basically the equivalent of 1521A4 in their laws. People have been doing similar things. And then third-party releases is an issue that is interesting in a lot of contexts, but has been something we've seen recently. Judge Glenn, again in the Southern District of New York, determined that he would recognize a foreign proceeding, but he was not going to recognize third-party releases that were part of I think it was a Singaporean plan, because he thought it was kind of contrary to our public policy, which is not too frequently invoked in these Chapter 15s. Chapter 15, for the most part, ends up being a rubber stamp, but seeing something like third-party releases being considered kind of beyond the scope of what at least Judge Glenn in that case was comfortable recognizing in the United States. So we think that will continue to be an interesting place to watch, and third-party releases are always interesting and definitely different perspectives from different judges in different parts of the country. But then there's this international overlay, which is definitely something to watch out for in 2023. And it's been, I think, thanks to everybody for coming in.